One of the great things about photography is no matter what your interests are, you can capture them on camera. But it's also a really good art form, and you can get really creative with your camera to come up with something that little bit different. One of these techniques is known as intentional camera movement, also known as ICM. And in this video, I'm going to teach you how you can do this for yourself and get some amazing results and images that look a little bit like this. Before I go into all the settings and how you actually undertake ICM photography, I thought I'd explain for anyone who doesn't know what it is, what it actually involves. So ICM, intentional camera movement, is all about moving your camera in certain ways to create effects within your images. Now we all know when we get into photography that people talk about keeping your images sharp and not having any blur in your photographs. And that's really good and what we'd expect for your normal styles of photography. But when it comes to getting creative, actually having a little bit of blur in your images or being able to move your camera around to create different effects can give you some really unique and interesting images. So that's basically what ICM is, using your camera as a paintbrush to paint the landscape of the objects around you and create shapes and patterns within them to give you an optical illusion style effect and just to create something a little bit different. So how do you actually do ICM photography? The most important setting on your camera to be considered when you're doing ICM is your shutter speeds. And what shutter speed you pick will all be determined on what effect you want to create, but also on how fast you intend to move your camera. Let me head over here and show you a demonstration of this, because really it's a lot more complicated when it comes to choosing settings, I think, than people realise. And I often get asked the question, what settings and shutter speed do you use for ICM? And the truth is, every single image is different, and this is why. I'm going to demonstrate this by using this cluster of grass here. Now of course today's a little bit windy, so you can see this is already blowing in the wind, which is going to naturally blur certain parts of this image. But for this demonstration, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 3 images for you, all of which will be exactly the same settings. So currently I am on f11, ISO 100, and I'm at 1/50th of a second. Now if I just take one snapshot of this here, you'll see it's a very crisp, clear image. It's not a great composition, but I'm trying to do this just to showcase the ICM effect. But you can see very crisp and clear. If I do this and move my camera slowly while I press the shutter button, we come away with this image here, which has got a very slight blur to it. However, if I move it really quickly while pressing the shutter button, we come away with an image that looks like this. Now, as I say, these aren't the best images in the world. I've not even thought about my composition, but I'm showcasing this just to showcase the technique here. So there's 2 elements to consider there. 1, the shutter speed that I chose, and 2, how quickly I move the camera. And as you can see by those 3 shots taken at exactly the same shutter speed, it just showcases how important the motion of the camera is, as well as the shutter speed itself. So when it comes to choosing your shutter speed, you really have to consider more, I would say, about the motion that you're going to use when you're moving your camera, because really that motion and how quickly you pan your camera up and down or side to side or in a circle is what really determines the final image, and not necessarily the shutter speeds. So the biggest tip and advice I give to people is to play around with your shutter speeds, and depending on what subject you're shooting will depend on what shutter speed you choose and how quickly you move your camera. But what I tend to find works best in terms of shutter speeds when doing ICM is to range anywhere between 1/20th of a second up to 1 second. But because it's a creative form of photography, it's really up to you what you pick and what effect you want to create. But another good thing here is to consider, what do you want to look like when you're doing ICM photography? Do you want to look like this? Or do you want to look like this? I often think looking like the slower motion person makes you look a little bit less eccentric when you're out with your camera. So that's always something else to consider, because I think ICM puts a lot of people off because they don't want to be this weird person walking around location waving their camera around. But if you don't want that to be you, just have a much slower shutter speed and move your camera nice and slowly, and nobody will even bat an eyelid. They won't even realise what you're doing, and you definitely won't look bizarre in the process. So that's the thing to consider there when deciding what shutter speed to use. Shutter speed you use and how you move your camera is very important, but another thing is in what direction you move your camera. Now, you will have seen in a lot of the photographs I've shown you in this video that I always move in line with the objects and the subjects that I'm shooting. So when you saw me give that example there of the grasses, I was panning up and down because the grasses are in an up and down fashion. If I was shooting here with the sea, I would tend to pan left to right so that I'm going in the same direction as the horizon and the waves. So depending on what you shoot will really depend on what direction you want to go in, but I often find that the best photographs come when you pan parallel with the object that you're shooting. Now, of course, if you're shooting into a vast open space like the sky, for instance, where you've got different shapes and textures in the clouds, or if you're shooting something like things on the ground, leaves or bark on the trees, you may want to try different techniques such as swirling your camera round and round, or moving it diagonally or in other types of directions to see what you can create. The great thing about ICM is there really is no rules, but work with your subjects, look at the textures and the tones and the direction that your thing is moving in and work with it. It will really benefit your photography, but get creative too and see what you can create by moving your camera in different directions. So that's pretty much it when it comes to ICM photography. Because you're shooting in this abstract style, things like depth of field don't matter the same because your images are going to be blurry. So you can decide what aperture you want to pick to get the best results. And really that will depend on how much light you want in your camera to increase or decrease your shutter speed. The same with your ISO. I would say not to bump it up very high because then your shutter speed's going to be too fast. So I tend to stick around ISO 100 in most cases, unless I'm shooting in low light conditions or after sunset, for instance, when there's not much light around. Then I might bump my ISO up to allow me to decrease my shutter speed to around 1/50th of a second or half a second to get the results that I want. But really ICM is about playing around with things, playing around with your settings, most importantly your shutter speeds, and playing around with moving your hands and your camera in different directions, panning with the lines and the landscape, and really looking at what is going on around you. It's a very mindful style of photography in many ways. Some people just go out there and just willy-nilly move their camera around and come away with some great results. But if you can take the time to really look at your subjects, look at what's around you, look at the patterns and the lines within them, and move your camera to coincide with what you're seeing, you'll come away with much better images because you're really looking and playing with those lines in nature or whatever other subjects you want to try ICM with. I hope this video has helped you. Because ICM is creative, there really is no right or wrong way to do it, but these tips I have given you today should set you on good stead to getting good images when you're out and about using your camera and trying ICM. As always, I want to say a huge thank you for watching, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you all again next time.